Welcome, 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 one and all. Thank you so much for coming here this evening. My name is Joseph Bednarik. I serve as the co-publisher here at Copper Canyon Press. I am coming to you live from my home in Port Townsend, Washington, which is on Coast Salish and Sklallam land. Wherever you may be in the world right now, we encourage you to familiarize yourself with the indigenous past and present of the place where you live. Personally, I am so delighted that you're here to celebrate the life and the poetry of Jim Harrison, and to help support this ambitious legacy project that's entering its fourth and final phase, the Heart's Work, Jim Harrison's poetic legacy. Just to let you know, we had to increase our Zoom license in order to accommodate all the people who wanted to come to the event tonight. So thank you very much. You are absolutely in the right place. In a community with fellow poetry lovers. If you're seeing and hearing me right now, we can all thank our tech wizards behind the scenes, Marissa Vito, Janine Armstrong, and Casey Tavares. Thank you, Marissa, Casey, and Janine for making this online event possible. And as always, we express our abundant gratitude to the National Endowment for the Arts, the Washington State Arts Commission, the Hawthornden Foundation, to our volunteer board of directors, both past and present, many of whom are in attendance tonight. I want to personally thank the hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of readers who over the past 6 years have supported the Heart's Work, Jim Harrison's poetic legacy. I hope that everyone here tonight will join us in this final phase. And as you may know, Jim called his poetry, both the reading and writing of poetry, his heart's work. And that's why we named this legacy project the Heart's Work. And all of this would not be possible without the support of Jim's immediate family, Mary, David, Anna, and Jamie. And we thank you for entrusting your brothers and your father's poetic legacy with Copper Canyon. Also, a few shout outs to folks I know who are out there. Joyce Harrington Bailey, Jim's longtime aide de camp and trustee of the Jim Harrison Trust. Debbie and Dan Gerber, Jana Turiano and Peter Lewis, Jim's bibliographer, Gregory Orr, Will Blythe, Liesel and Hank Meyer, Larry Mawby and Lois Bailey, Stephen Spencer, who runs the indispensable Facebook page for Jim Harrison, our friends at Consortium Book Sales and Distribution. A special shout out to the Evans family, Sarah Mel, Austin, and John, to Jim's publishers in New York City, Grove, Morgan Entrican, Judy Hottenson, and Amy Hundley. And finally, a huge thank you to one of the country's greatest book collectors, Bruce Kahn, who has faithfully supported the mission of Copper Canyon for decades. I actually had the good fortune of visiting with Bruce this summer and seeing his stunning collection of Jim Harrison material. It was amazing. So thank you, thank you, thank you, Bruce, for your support. And so tonight, we are all helping to celebrate and expand the readership for Jim's 7th book of poems called The Theory and Practice of Rivers. Reflecting back on my own reading life, I received my first copy of Theory and Practice of Rivers as a birthday gift when I turned 22. And I carried that paperback with me pretty much everywhere. And I read poems aloud to everyone who would listen. And by reading those poems aloud, I was spreading the word from person to person to person about Jim's poetry. Now, at that time, none of my friends knew who Jim was. And I remember one of my professors asking me, it's like, sort of irritated actually, because I kept bugging him about Jim Harrison. He's like, all right. So tell me why? Why do you love this guy's work so much? And to me, that was music to my ears, because it was a huge opening where I could finally talk about Jim Harrison. And decades later, I actually sent that same professor a copy of the Essential Poems, which Copper Canyon had just published. And I included a short note that read in part, I love this guy even more now. So now, through the Heart's Work, you can join the fun of sharing the work by helping supporting the publication, promotion, and distribution of the Theory and Practice of Rivers. Throughout tonight, we're going to share links in the chat. We will have QR codes on the screen. And all these will take you to a special page on the Copper Canyon Press website where you can make a tax-deductible donation. You can also go to our website, anytime, open 24/7, and you can easily find the page. Our goal, our total goal, is to raise $75,000 by June 30. And tonight, we are trying to raise at least a third of that, $25,000 for this event, which would be an appropriate and proper launch toward the final goal. And please know that every donation helps. And for a donation of $150, your name will be printed on a special acknowledgments page in the book. And this has been a feature of all of the books that we have published as part of the Heart's work. And frankly, it's my favorite part, seeing all those names of all those people who love Jim's work and who are helping to bring poems and books into the world. And not only that, but to have those books and poems travel far and wide. So as I mentioned, links in the chat, QR codes on screen, visit Copper Canyon website 24/7. Please make your donation. Be generous. And also, if you feel like it, invite your friends. And so for some context for tonight's event, we began the Heart's work back in 2018. And together we've published 5 books with a 6th on the way. We've published Dead Man's Float in paperback. We published The Essential Poems. We published Collected Hustles. We published a big, thick book called Complete Poems, both as a single volume and as a 3-volume box set. We published Braided Creek, an expanded anniversary edition, and now we're raising funds for this final project, The Theory and Practice of Rivers, as a standalone book. And what's interesting about the Heart's work, one of the things that we did, a special feature of it, was to catalyze critical conversations about Jim's poetry. And we also included an introduction or an afterword for each book. And we're honored to have published, or soon to publish, pieces by Rebecca Solnit, who's here with us tonight, Terry Tempest Williams, Naomi Shihab Nye, John Freeman, Colin McCann, Denver Butson, Joy Williams, and Ted Kuzer. I encourage you all to read these deep and these touching pieces. And if you're so inclined, write your own review of Jim's poetry, a reflection on Jim's poetry, and publish it somewhere. And so to begin, tonight I want to share with you 2 personal stories about the theory and practice of rivers. First, for years, this broadside hung right next to my front door. It is the poem called Kobun from the Theory and Practice of Rivers. And it reads, Hote didn't need a Zafu saying that his ass was sufficient. The head's a cloud anchor that the feet must follow. Travel light, he said, or don't travel at all. And so every time I left my house, I was reminded to travel light. And of course, I kept seeing that broadside and I memorized the poem. And I carry that poem with me wherever I go, part of my traveling light. My second story about theory and practice of rivers. In the fall after Jim died, there was a memorial dinner at the Murray Hotel in Livingston, Montana. I was an invited guest. I sat next to the great Montana painter Russell Chatham during dinner. The event, absolutely magnificent. It's the last time I smoked cigarettes. And of course, the next day, I was invited to enter, for one last time, Jim's writing studio, alone. So there I was, in the writing studio where I had been at many, many times before, working with Jim on his poetry titles like Saving Daylight and Dead Man's Float. I was there, alone, listening, watching, feeling. I bowed to the desk. I bowed to Jim's altar. And then I opened the door to leave for a final time. Travel light, he said, or don't travel at all. And after I left the studio, I discovered one of Jim's closest friends weeping. I put my arm around his shoulder, make some human-to-human contact. I want my friend back, he sobbed. I want my friend back. And I knew exactly what he meant. But the river moves in one direction. And the next day, in a gesture of supreme grace, Jim's family offered the opportunity to steward one of Jim's keepsakes, one of the objects that he kept in his writing studio. Let us know what you might want, they said. And I knew exactly which object I would love to bring into my life. Seemingly mundane object that I saw on Jim's altar many, many times. And here are two couplets from the poem Looking Forward to Age, from Theory and Practice of Rivers. If I have become famous, I'll wear a green janitor suit and row a wooden boat. From a key ring on my belt will hang 33 keys that open no doors. I asked for the key ring with 33 keys that open no doors. And a few months later, this treasure arrived. I hope you can see and hear. And I laughed, of course, because there are only 12 keys, proving once again that numbers were not Jim's strong suit. This is one of my most prized possessions, though my more literal-minded friends might ask, why would you want keys that open no doors? To which I respond, because these keys also do not lock any doors. And thus we are gifted a key ring, and thus we are gifted a poem. I miss my friend, though I visit with him frequently whenever I open his books and read lines like this from the Theory and Practice of Rivers. I forget where I heard that poems are designed to waken sleeping gods. In our time, they've taken on nearly unrecognizable shapes, as gods will do. And so tonight, I promise you this, I will be reading Jim Harrison's poems until I can read no longer. And I invite you to do the same. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Todd Goddard as our first guest. Todd is a professor of literary studies at Utah Valley University, and he's the author of the forthcoming biography entitled Devouring Time, Jim Harrison, A Life. Todd Goddard.
Joseph, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and greetings, everyone. This is fantastic. It's truly an international, intimate gathering of Harrisonians. I am absolutely thrilled to be here, to be joining Joseph and Jamie and Rebecca and all of you out there from a very diverse set of places, it looks like. And talking about reading and listening to Jim's poetry. I mean, what could be better? I'm also super excited about the forthcoming reissue of the Theory and Practice of Rivers, as I know you are. And to be honest, I can hardly wait to read Rebecca's introduction. It's going to be fantastic. My personal fascination with Jim's poetry was probably the driving force for me to begin writing a biography. And the book has taken me on a pretty unforgettable journey, quite literally. I've traveled to Michigan, Montana, Patagonia, Arizona, Mississippi, New York, and France, and especially to Grand Valley State University near Grand Rapids, Michigan, where Jim's collected papers are housed. His archive of papers is a colossal collection of materials. It includes about 119 boxes of his private correspondence alone, and literally hundreds of boxes of handwritten drafts, notebooks, screenplays, photos, memorabilia. It takes up an entire section of a massive basement in the bottom of the archive. And I spent nearly 4 months there working on this book, making a daily trek across campus to Seidman House, working with the wonderful archivists there. But I'll tell you, my research has always been, of course, in careful conversation with Jim's work, and especially with his poetry. Poetry was Jim Harrison's first love. He would refer to it as the true bones of his life. He thought it was what he'd be remembered for. And time and again, in moments of distress or depression, some of his darkest times, really, it was poetry that would pull him through it. It would nourish and restore him. And some of those darkest times were some of the most productive times for his poetry as well. When Jim set about writing his memoir Off to the Side around 2000, he wrote to one of his closest friends, Tom McGuane, that he had the deepest questions about the project. For one, he worried that everything he had to say was already in his work, or in his music, as he put it in that letter. He also worried that reliving certain early memories, like the deaths of his father Winfield and his beloved sister Judy, both of whom some of you may know were tragically killed together in a car accident when Jim was in his 20s, would be harrowing indeed, as he put it. Of course, he went on to write off to the side, and he thought it worth writing. But I think his observation speaks in part to the intensely autobiographical nature of his work. His poetry, I think, is a distillation of a lifetime study of consciousness. And I like to think that nowhere else had Jim been so probing and honest and observant about what he thought of the world and his life in it. You can open almost randomly to any poem in Copper Canyon's magnificent Jim Harrison complete poems and find that it's in some way autobiographical. I mean, just think of poems like Marriage or Diabetes or Barebacked Writer or And Where is Jim Harrison? One of his very first poems is a great example of this, and I think in a way it would set the tone for all that would follow. I'm going to read a selection. It's one of my favorite poems because it's so early and it's raw in a way that only a very early work can be. It's called Sketch for a Job Application Blank, and it's from his collection Plain Song, which was published in 1965. Here goes. My left eye is blind and jogs like a milky sparrow in its socket. My nose is large and never flares in anger. The front teeth bucked, but not in lechery. I sucked my thumb until the age of 12. Oh, my youth was happy and I was never lonely, though my friends called me pig eye and the teachers thought me loony. When I bruised, my psyche kept intact. I fell from horses and once a cow, but never pigs. A neighbor lost a hand to a sow. But I had some fears. The salesman of eyes, his case was full of fishy baubles against black velvet, jeweled gore. The great cocked hoof of a Belgian mare, a nest of milk snakes by the water trough, electric fences, my uncle's hounds, the pump arm of an oil well, the chop and whir of a combine in the sun. From my ancestors, the Swedes, I suppose I inherit the love of rainy woods, kegs of herring and neat whiskey. I remember long nights of pinochle, the bulge of red man in my grandpa's cheek. The rug smelled of manure and kerosene. They laughed loudly and didn't speak for days. But on the other side, from the German Mennonites, their rag-smoked prayers and porky daughters, I got intolerance and aimless diligence. In 51, during a revival, I was saved. I prayed on a cold register for hours and woke up lame. I was baptized by immersion in the tank at Williamston. The rusty water stung my eyes. I left off the old things of the flesh, but not for long. Jim had written that poem soon after his wife Linda and his mother, Norma, sort of by family consent, basically shipped Jim off to Boston in the early 1960s to find a job. After the deaths of Winfield and Judy, Jim had ground to a depressive standstill. He wasn't working, he wasn't really writing, though he desperately wanted to. And he would stay in Boston with his brother John and his wife Rebecca, or Becky, there while he looked for a job. He would stay up late at night in the kitchen writing poems, some of the first complete poems of his life, as he was assembling Plain Song. The title Sketch for a Job Application Blank, as you can imagine, right, was written in the midst of this frantic job search in Boston. He was busy filling out applications and Becky was typing them for him, typing his cover letters, and Jim was putting in applications all over the place. Job was a word that Jim very much disliked at the time. The beginnings of that poem, as you heard, address the loss of vision in Jim's left eye, that milky socket, which the accident occurred during a childhood accident. And it describes his really his affective response to it. It speaks to his fears, as he writes. At one point, Jim had been sold a thick lens for his eye by sort of a snake oil salesman type. And the lens was supposed to restore some vision in his eye. And of course, the lens didn't work. It didn't improve his sight. And Jim wound up tossing it into the woods behind his house eventually, along with his hopes. And to make matters worse, he'd spent a lot of money. He'd saved all this money for a trip to France that he had put toward the lens. And he would fall into quite a depression afterward. Jim goes on in that poem to reflect on his rural upbringing in Michigan, his grandparents' farm, and his own brief but intense infatuation with the Baptist faith, when he had become a sort of stump preacher at revivalist meetings, attending religious retreats and such. And for a time, Jim Harrison rejected everything from foul language to drinking, smoke, sex, and even dancing in the name of religion, the old things of the flesh, as he calls it in the poem. Now, jump ahead many years later, in the mid-1980s, Jim would dedicate the theory and practice of rivers to Gloria Ellen Harrison, 1964 to 1979, as the dedication reads. Gloria was Jim's niece and the daughter of his brother John and sister-in-law Becky, who he'd stayed with in Boston. In the fall of 1979, soon after the release of Jim's Legends of the Fall, Gloria was tragically hit by a car while riding her bike near Guilford, Connecticut, over Labor Day weekend. She would lie in a coma until December, when the family finally removed her from life support after Christmas. The memorial service, which Jim writes about in Theory and Practice, was held on a Saturday, December 29th, at an Episcopalian church that John and Becky attended in New Haven. And the cemetery, I think, was close to the water. Everyone would remember the glitter of Long Island Sound in the distance and the cold, piercing wind that blew off of it that day. And the Theory and Practice of Rivers as a collection, I believe, is a deeply meditative work that mourns Gloria and reflects on her death. At one point in the collection, like I said, Jim recalls her burial service, and I'd like to read a selection. This is from the title poem, Theory and Practice of Rivers. Jim writes, near the estuary north of Guilford, my brother recites the Episcopalian burial service over his dead daughter, Gloria, as in Gloria in excelsis. I cannot bear this passion and courage. My eyes turn toward the swamp and see, so blurred they'll never quite clear themselves again. The inside of the eye, vitreous humor, is the same pulp found inside the squid. I can see Gloria in the snow and in the water. She lives in the snow and water and in my eyes. This is a song for her. Now, her death is real and immediate and painful as anything. Nonetheless, I think inevitably echoed the death of Judy for the entire family. Both died at a tragically young age. Gloria's middle name, Ellen, was also Judy's middle name. As Jim would later write, speaking of the pain the family felt at the time, he wrote, nothing is harder to deal with than a small casket. After the collection was released, John wrote to thank Jim. He said this, he wrote this, art and duckheads are long, duckheads. I believe Ezra Pound said that, and even though most of his work remains beyond me, that statement does not. A long poem and a river poem to boot. John was deeply moved, of course, that Jim had chosen to remember Gloria in the poems, and he felt nourished, in his words, by the collection. He'd add at the end of the letter, I am pleased at age 50 that I still love my brother. Jim had also sent a collection to his mother, Norma, as a surprise, and she too was touched by it. She had enjoyed it immensely, she wrote to her son, feeling that I was seeing you a bit, and loving sentences like, I'm trying to become alert enough to live, and your reference to John reading the funeral service. Jim had once mentioned to his mother that she might find it difficult to read his work, as it so often dealt with the deaths of family members, directly or indirectly, but the reverse seemed to be true. Jim later wrote that the collection as a whole was an attempt to render what could keep one alive in a progressively more unpleasant world. And the answers he provides, I think, in the collection seem to lie with his own family and the natural world. As he would write, the rivers of my life, moving looms of light, wolf prints and alluvial fan, the sun, the moon, the earth, and his daughter Jamie's visits to home. And it seems to me that Jim was always looking for and often finding reasons to live in a diminishing world. And I think that goes all the way back to letters from Yesenin. In an interview with his friend Jim Fergus for the Paris Review, Jim would say that in a life properly lived, you're a river. You touch things lightly or deeply. You move along because life herself moves, and you can't stop it. You can't figure out a banal game plan applicable to all situations. You just have to go with the beingness of life. I love that. And I think that was what Jim meant by fluidity, something he had learned from spending so much time on and around rivers, fishing, swimming. That was movement. That was whirl, a word he liked to use. That was dancing. He'd also say in that same interview that even the next meal is worth waiting for. Not a terribly surprising claim or statement coming from Jim Harrison, of course. Indeed, he describes in that collection a meal he made with Jamie when she returned home to Michigan from New York City that I'm always sort of envious about and want to be eating at the moment. Venison with truffles, he writes. Also roast quail for Christmas breakfast. Also a wild turkey, some roast mallards and grouse. Also a cacciatore of rabbit and pheasant. Before I pass the conversation along and back to Joseph, I'd like to conclude by reading one more poem from the collection Saving Daylight. It's called The Man Who Looked for Sunlight. And as I read this, maybe, think about the way Jim uses the word sunlight in here. It reminds me of a ship's bell ringing in a deep fog at night. And it increases as the poem moves steadily toward relief and a resolution. 9 days of dark, cold rain in October, some snow, 3 gales of off Lake Superior with the cabin's tin roof humming Beethoven. The woodcock weather vane whirling and thumping like a kettle drum. Tree limbs crashing in the woods. At dawn, a gust made small whitecaps on the river. Marquette NPR promised sunlight on Thursday. I sit here reflecting. I burned a whole cord of wood this week. I'm 10 years old again, sitting here waiting for the sunlight, petting my dog Rose, sitting by the window, straining for sunlight. I'm not going to drown myself in the cold, dark river, but I really would like sunlight. Finally, clouds rush by, well beyond the speed limit, and there's a glimpse of sunlight, a few seconds of sunlight, enough for today. The sunlight glistening on the wet forest, and my dog sleeping by the window. I'll close out my section for the evening with those beautiful words and with sunlight, and thank everyone again for joining in tonight. Thank you so much.
Oh my goodness, Todd, that was gorgeous. Thank you so much for that discussion of Jim. I absolutely cannot wait to read your biography. And once it arrives, it is going right to the top of my reading list. Really gorgeous, gorgeous insights. Thank you. And I love the idea of you sitting at the archive in Grand Rapids at Grand Valley State University. It is absolutely one of my holy sites on the planet. So now it's time to introduce Jim's eldest daughter, Jamie Harrison. Jamie is the author of 6 novels, including the extraordinary The Widow Nash. She was also, years and years and years ago, the managing editor of Clark City Press. And for some very deep intel, Jim's poem, A Lullaby for a Daughter, was written for Jamie. And we're actually going to hear Jim read that poem a little later in the evening. So, Jamie, please join us.
Hi. Thank you, Joseph. And thank you, Todd, for that wonderful introduction of all my father's varied facets. I really want to thank Copper Canyon for doing this massive, long heart's work in putting everything out, and for all the people who did the lovely essays that have gone in the fronts of all of the books. Really beautiful work from Joy Williams, John Freeman, Rebecca Solnit, Colin McCann. A couple of things that Todd talked about that I kind of wanted to react to. First, I love the fact that he talked about the variety of my dad and his family, really loving, earthy, hardcore family who went through some very hard times, the deaths of daughters in a couple of generations, which really marked all of us. But I also want to point out that, he wrote about food a lot. He was a very earthy guy. He he wrote transcendent poetry, but he was a very impatient man. But one thing people need to know about the whole feeding me wonderful food at Christmas bit, I just want to get this in there, is that whole essay is talking about how he's a food bully, and he'd actually brought me to tears by the morning of that meal because he'd fed me so much. It was just so far gone. The bacchanal every time we'd get together. But anyway, I want to read one poem I'm going to read here is kind of more the angry Jim, the Jim who grew up in Michigan, who's from a family of Swedish socialists. And then the others are really about family. They're about his great-grandfather, and they're about the slow wind down and his really difficult last few years. He thought of poetry as something that heals, but this first one, the brand new Statue of Liberty, which is dedicated to Lee Iacocca, is Jim on fire at the ugliness of the world. I was commissioned in a dream by a manja, also the Black Pope of Brazil, Tancred, to design a 7-tiered necklace of 7,000 skulls for the Statue of Liberty. Of course, from a distance, they'll look like pearls, but in November, when the strongest winds blow, the skulls will rattle wildly, bone against metal, a crack and chatter of bone against metal, the true sound of history, this metal striking bone. I'm not going to get heavy-handed. A job is a job, and I've leased a football field for the summer, gathered a group of ladies who are art lovers, leased in advance, a Bull Sikorsky freight helicopter to drop on the necklace. Funding comes from Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, the NEA. There is one Jewish skull from Atlanta, 2 from Mississippi, but this is basically an indigenous cast, except skulls from tribes of blacks who got a free ride over from Africa, representative skulls from all the Indian tribes, an assortment of grizzly, wolf, coyote, and buffalo skulls. But what beauty when the morning summer sun glances off these bony pates, and her great iron lips, quivering in a smile, almost a smirk, so that she'll drop the torch to fondle the jewels. And now for a change of pace. This is this poem, What He Said When I Was 11, is about my great-grandparents, Hulda and John Walgren, who, if anybody's read the novel Farmer, this is essentially the setting for this. And my father spent a lot of his childhood at their place. They were very, very poor. They bought very bad land. They had a hard time making it, and they were still in the middle of that hard time when he was a boy. What he said when I was 11. August, a dense heat wave at the cabin, mixed with torrents of rain. The 2 tracks become miniature rivers. In the Russian Orthodox Church, one does not talk to God, one sings. This empty and sun-blasted land has a voice rising in shimmers. I did not sing in Moscow, but St. Basil's in Leningrad raised quiet tune. But now 7 worlds away, I hang the Casus Moscas from the ceiling and catch 7 flies in the first hour, buzzing madly against the stickiness. I've never seen the scissor-tailed flycatcher, a favorite bird of my youth, the worn Audubon card pinned on the wall. When I miss flies 3 times with the swatter, they go free for good. Fair is fair. There's too much nature pressing against the window as if it were a green night, and the river swirling in glazed turbulence is less friendly than ever before. 40 years ago, she called home, come home, it's supper time. I was fishing a fishless cattle pond with a new $3 pole, dreaming the dark blue ocean of pictures. In the barn, I threw down hay while my Swede grandpa finished milking, squirting the barn cat's mouth with an udder. I kissed the wet nose of my favorite cow, drank a dipper of fresh warm milk, and carried 2 pails to the house, scraping the manure off my feet in the pump shed. She poured the milk in the cream separator, and I began cranking. At supper, the oilcloth was decorated with worn pink roses. We ate cold herring and the bluegills we'd caught at daylight. The fly strip above the table idled in the window's breeze, a new fly in its death buzz. Grandpa said, "We are all flies." That's what he said 40 years ago. This poem, the next one, Cabin Poem, was written after he got a cabin in the Upper Peninsula, and he'd go out to the Dune Saloon most nights when he was up there in Grand Marais, Michigan. And in fact, sometimes would dance. He was a very good dancer. This is shocking, but it's true. Part 1, the blonde girl with the polka heart. 1 foot, then another, then aerial and a twisting jump, chin upward with a scream of such splendor, I go back to my cabin and start a fire. 2, art and life, drunk and sober, empty and full, guilt and grace, cabin and home, north and south, struggle and peace, after which we catch a glimpse of stars, the white glistening pelt of the Milky Way, hear the startled bear crashing through the Delta swamp below me. In these troubled times, I go inside and start a fire. 3, I am the bird that hears the worm, or, my cousin said, the pulse of a wound that probes to the opposite side. I have abandoned alcohol, cocaine, the news, and outdoor prayer at support systems. How can I make a case? How can you make a case for yourself before an ocean of trees, or standing waist deep in the river, or sitting in the log jam with a pistol? I reject oneness with bears. She has 2 cubs and thinks she owns the swamp I thought I bought. I shoot once in the air to tell her it's my turn at the log jam for an hour's thought about nothing. Perhaps that is oneness with bears. I've decided to make my mind up about nothing, to assume the water mask, to finish my life disguised as a creek, an eddy, joining at night the full sweet flow, to absorb the sky, to swallow the heat and cold, the moon and the stars, to swallow myself in ceaseless flow. And I want to do one last late poem that's sort of about the end of things, where my parents lived in this pretty place in Livingston, outside of Livingston. It's called Galactic. Sitting out in my chair near Linda's garden, a mixture of flowers and vegetables, pink iris, wild poppies, roses, blue salvia and veronica, among tomatoes, green beans, eggplant, and onion. I think that I sense the far-flung galaxies and hear a tinge of the solar winds. Where is my dead brother? I want to know. With so many infirmities, I await the miraculous. Galaxies are grand thickets of stars in which we may hide forever. Anyway, thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Todd and Rebecca. I can't wait to hear. Thanks so much.
Jamie, thank you. Wow, to listen to you read your father's poems, very, very powerful. And the brand new Statue of Liberty, absolutely one of my favorites. And in these times, the true sound of history, this metal striking bone, comes to my mind all the time. And to just hear you read, huge honor. Thank you very much. Before we move on to our final live speaker, we do have Jim's voice a little later in the program. I wanted to let everyone know at this point, I am absolutely delighted to say that we have raised about $18,000 toward our goal of $25,000 tonight. This is amazing. If you have yet to donate this evening, please look for those links in the chat. Use the QR code that's on the screen. Please visit our website. You can do that at 3 in the morning tonight. Please make a donation online, and every donation helps secure and advance Jim's legacy as a great American poet. And every donor to this final phase of the Heart's work, every donor is going to receive an emergency poem wallet card. And this was inspired by Rebecca Solnit's quote from a New York Times art blog. I just love this. When we found it, we were just like, oh my God, we have to create this wallet card. So this is a quote. Jim Harrison's poetry has been hovering pleasantly all summer. One poem is now in my wallet for emergencies. And when I emailed Rebecca about that, she said, yeah, that poem, I ripped it out from one of Copper Canyon's catalogs. And I just thought, what a beautiful thing. You know, Copper Canyon puts poems in catalogs, sends them out into the world. Rebecca Solnit rips it out, puts it in her wallet, just in case. I love that idea. So thank you very much, Rebecca, for that idea. And speaking of Rebecca Solnit, our final guest, before hearing Jim read his poems, is in fact Rebecca Solnit. She's writing the introduction to the new edition of Theory and Practice of Rivers. When we first invited Rebecca to write her intro, the email we received in reply, this is, I think, the best subject line I've ever had in an email. This was the subject line. As it happens, I love that Jim Harrison book a lot. Rebecca Solnit is the author of more than 20 books on feminism, Western and urban history, popular power, social change, insurrection, wandering and walking, hope and catastrophe. Her books include Orwell's Roses, Recollections of My Non-Existence, and the powerful book, Men Explain Things to Me. It is an honor to have Rebecca with us this evening. Rebecca, please.
Thank you so much. I am honored to be here. Many years ago, I was invited to read with the poets at the Bay Area Watershed Poetry Festival. And the first thought that sprang into my mind unbidden was, I've been promoted, which is kind of how I rate poetry in the ranks of literature. So, I thought I would start with a poem on a relatively early one, the first section of Natural World, that, like so many of Jim Harrison's poems, invites us to disorient ourselves, lose our sense of scale in the world, or move through time at a different pace, fast or slow. But Natural World. The earth is almost round. The seas are curved and hug the earth. Both ends are crowned with ice. The great blue whale swims near this ice. His heart is warm and weighs 2,000 pounds. His tongue weighs twice as much. He weighs 150 tons. There are so few of him left, he often can't find a mate. He drags his 6-foot sex through icy waters, flukes spread crashing. His brain is large enough for a man to sleep in. So I'm talking to you on the unceded territory of the Coast Miwok, the land that I grew up on my northern part of it. I drank mostly out of the Russian River all through my childhood, which is over there on Pomo territory. But as an adult, I mostly live on the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge on the unceded territory of the Ramaytush Ohlone, where I mostly drink water from the Tuolumne watershed in Hetch Hetchy. One of the things a lot of San Franciscans don't know is every goddamn cup of coffee and, glass of lemonade we have that with water that comes out of the faucet used to be snowmelt sometime earlier that year or whenever it entered the reservoirs and the river, which is just to say, all of us are somewhere between 60 and 80% water. For a lot of us, it comes from rivers. So as a reasonably sentient water container, I greet all you fellow water containers here to think about the flow of language and the theory and practice of rivers, which really is a book I love. This is my copy. It's probably been to every state in the Southwest. I've had it a long time. Bought it in a used bookstore when I was probably still pretty poor. And Todd read a quote from one of Jim Harrison's interviews. I'm not on a first name basis with him yet, but I want to read it again because it's so germane to what I want to say too. He wrote, or rather he said, I think in the Paris Review interview, "In a life properly lived, you're a river. You touch things lightly or deeply. You move along because life herself moves, and you can't stop it. You can't figure out a banal game applicable to all situations. You just have to go with the beingness of life, as Rilke would have it. In Sundogs, Stang says a dam doesn't stop a river, it just controls the flow. Technically speaking, you can't stop one at all." And I love that the beingness, which reminds me that he was such a deep devotee of Zen Buddhism, and the dam reminds me of his early novel, I think Ed Abbey ripped off, where 4 young conspirators conspire to blow up a dam and on the Colorado River and let the river go free. And so Jim Harrison had a generous spirit, a great love of place, and a gift for commenting, for connecting things intended to be far apart. An incredible vividness in his work, which is really striking to me. I write prose, but I go to poetry for joy and pleasure, because it always reminds me that language doesn't have to just sort of trudge along dutifully, going one step at a time. It can leap, it can fly, it can lie down and dream. It can move in ways that are not so linear and rational. So I always feel like poetry invites me to do better, more interesting things with my own language, even if it comes in paragraphs instead of stanzas or couplets or poetic forms. And I think of Tracy K. Smith, who recently said, "But poetry, which awakens our senses, frees us from the tyranny of literal meaning, and assures us of the credible reality of emotional truth, puts us in touch with something bigger than language, something I believe each of us was perhaps fluent in, before the moment when language became our chief vehicle for meaning." She continues, "I'm operating on the belief that poetry can restore me to the large original self I haven't yet learned to fully recognize," which I think is such a good description of what Jim Harrison does, invite us at least to restore ourselves to this large, unruly, reckless, passionate, irrational, deeply sensing, sensory, embodied, but also deeply spiritual, because the most sensual and the most spiritual are not always so far apart. It's that kind of boring social practical stuff in the middle that we get stuck in. I think also of the great poet and great poet of water, Natalie Diaz, who said, "I mean river as a verb, a happening. It is moving within me right now." She talks about how in her own people's language in Mojave, people and water are not so separate. And so I might end up using this in the introduction, but when I was just trying to think about the theory and practice of rivers, that great 20-page poem in the collected works, which looks like a river itself, it's short lines, and it goes on and on and on. I want to print it out and glue it all together, so I'll have something that'll probably be about 15 feet long and, 2 inches wide, and have the river of poetry it is. So I want to approach this project with 2 proposals. One is that we are all rivers and everything is a river, and the other one is that rivers don't exist. If you're familiar with Zen Buddhism, you're probably pretty familiar and comfortable with paradox, but I will try and unpack that paradox a little bit to say that a river, pardon me while I flutter some pages around, 2-sided printer at this place I'm staying at, which I'm not used to. But I want to just talk a little bit about what a river is. It's not a body of water, because the water in it is constantly entering and exiting the riverbed. It's not the bed itself. It's not just the flow, but snow melt, water from creeks, from smaller bodies, smaller moving bodies of water, from springs, snow melt, sometimes out from lakes, goes into the river and doesn't stay there. It evaporates, it goes out into other bodies of water. Here in California, our 17 great rivers all flow into San Francisco Bay, a colossal watershed on their way to the Pacific. And so I once spent 3 days trying to find the exact location with the two photographers I worked with on a book about Yosemite, Mark Klett and Byron Wolf. 3 days looking for where Edward Muybridge took a picture of the Merced River in 1872. We assumed it was someplace on the riverbanks as we found them and wandered back and forth on them. It took the guys who are so much better at this than me to figure out that the river was not where it had been in 1872, because even a riverbed is not a stable thing any more than the water in it. So rivers don't exist because everything in them is transitory, changing. No part of the river is the whole river. The river is not, and the river is not just the sum of its parts. In a sense, a river is what a human being is, a verb in drag as a noun, pretending to be solid, self-contained, coherent, independent, while the world streams in and out and through us and them. We say Nile or Mississippi or Musqueam and Tushoti in northern British Columbia are, as though a river is a thing, an object like a fork or, a block. But it's this flow. And in a sense, as I mentioned, so are we. So in language, in this language of ours that loves its compartments so well, a river is treated as a noun, and a noun seems to describe a discrete object. But nothing is really a discrete object. Everything is coming and going and morphing and changing. We say an object is here when we mean a system, a process, a gathering of forces or elements is happening. A river is something else or many things, or as Natalie Diaz points out, a verb as much as a noun. It's a place where waters gather and flow, where they keep moving. And one of the things that I think is so central to Jim Harrison's poetry is the idea that everything is in motion, everything is in flux, everything is in transformation, which is sorrow and loss and death, but also birth, things coming towards you, things moving away from you, the water coming into the river, the water coming out. I found a really nice scientific article from the USDA website that says rivers are truly perceived not as things in space, but processes through time. Because sometimes you can find scientific literature, even in poetry. And with that, I'm going to read a poem or two and try not to take up more than my allotted time and continue with your questions, and which we might not have answers to, which is all good because Rilke reminded us to love the questions more. So River One by Jim Harrison. I was there in a room in a village by the river when the moon fell into the window frame and was trapped there too long. I was fearful, but I was upside down, and my prayers fell off the ceiling. Our small dog Jacques jumped on the sofa near the window, perched on the sofa's back, and released the moon to head south. Just after dawn, standing in the green yard, I watched a girl ride down the far side of the railroad tracks on a beauteous white horse whose lower legs were wrapped in red tape. Above her head were mountains covered with snow. I decided we were born to be moving water, not ice. And one more, and then I'll hand it back to Joe. Debtors, a late poem. They used to say we're living on borrowed time, but even when young I wondered, who loaned it to us? In 1948, one grandpa died stretched tight in a misty oxygen tent, his 4 sons gathered, his papery hand grasping mine. Only a week before we were fishing. Now the 4 sons have all run out of borrowed time. While I'm alive, wondering whom I owe for this indisputable gift of existence. Of course, time is running out. It always has been a creek heading east, the freight of water with its surprising heaviness, following the slant of the land, its destiny. What is lovelier than a creek or riverine thicket? Say it is an unknown benefactor who gave us birds and Mozart, the mystery of trees and water, and all living things borrowing time. Would I still love the creek if I lasted forever? Thank you, everybody. Such a pleasure and an honor, and a little bit of a
Rebecca, oh my goodness, thank you so much. Just listening to you talk about rivers and Jim's poetry, I am so delighted that you're going to be part of this project moving forward, and I'm really eager to read that introduction. That is going to be fantastic. So to close out the evening this morning, or this evening this morning, that's very funny. Two opposites meeting right there in the middle. To close out, we are going to share some archival recordings of Jim reading 4 of his poems. And this is essentially a world premiere. To set the stage, this recording took place in Seattle back in October 2000. Jim was in Seattle for a benefit reading for Copper Canyon Press. Jim was always generous with us. From the very first book that we published, he wanted to be here and he wanted to help, and we adored him for that. And while he was in town, we asked Jim whether he would also be willing to go into the sound studio to record an interview and then to record an hour or so of poems. He agreed. He said, because again, Copper Canyon was the publisher of his heart's work, and the most significant problem for this arrangement was that Jim was not allowed to smoke in the studio. So as the minutes turned into that first hour, he was getting increasingly antsy. Imagine the scene. He's nibbling on this nicotine gum, and he was also sipping out of a very small plastic cup a favorite French wine, a Bandol from Domaine Tempier, which was a gift from his dear friend Peter Lewis. If you listen close to this recording, you can hear the nibbling, you can hear the sipping. It's actually quite fun. I was actually there in the studio with Jim. I was feeding him poems. Copper Canyon at that time, we envisioned an audiobook of Jim reading. We still have the dream that what might happen one of these days. And we wanted to record representative poems from each of his books. And so tonight we're going to hear 4 poems from 4 different books. The final poem is going to close with the final poem from the Theory and Practice of Rivers called Counting Birds. We're going to hear at the outset of the recording Jim calling himself Little Jimmy. He sort of, he's got a low tone to his voice, so you got to be a little sharp to hear that one. And then you can also hear the laughter of the sound engineer. And then Jim does this very eccentric countdown, which proves once again, numbers aren't a strong suit. And also a heads up, before the last poem, we included some of the studio chatter, so you get to hear the warmth of Jim's voice and also his infectious and cackling laughter. Please enjoy.
Little Jimmy, that's me. Yeah. 10, 9, 4, 7, 3, 2, 0, 1. Anyone that has children reads to them, and I was getting bored early with our first daughter reading lullabies to her, so I wrote a little lullaby during a relatively dark time. Lullaby for a daughter. Go to sleep. Night is a coal pit full of black water. Night's a dark cloud full of warm rain. Go to sleep. Night is a flower resting from bees. Night's a green sea swollen with fish. Go to sleep. Night is a white moon riding her mare. Night's a black sun burned to black cinder. Go to sleep, nights come, cat's day, owl's day, stars feast to praise, moon to reign over her sweet subject, dark. I suppose this poem started with my obsession with fishing. Fishing as a tonic or antidote to our civilization, because it seems like so much one of our basic hunting gathering practices. It's called the drinking song. I want to die in the saddle, an enemy of civilization. I want to walk around in the woods, fish and drink. I'm going to be a child about it, and I can't help it. I was born this way, and it makes me very happy to fish and drink. I left when it was still dark and parked on the path to the river, the Yellow Dog, where I spent the day fishing and drinking. After she left me and I quit my job and wept for a year and all my poems were born dead, I decided I would only fish and drink. Water will never leave earth, and whiskey is good for the brain. What else am I supposed to do in these last days but fish and drink? And the river was a trout, and I was on the bank, my heart in my chest, clouds above. She was in New York forever, and I fishing and drinking. Dogen's Dream. Dogen being the great Zen philosopher from Japan. Dogen's Dream. What happens when the god of spring meets spring? He thinks for a moment of great whales traveling from the bottom to the top of earth. The day the voyage begins 7 million years ago, when spring last changed its season. He enters himself, emptiness desiring emptiness. He sleeps, and his sleep is the dance of all of the birds on earth flying north. Cut.
Okay.
Let's not forget counting birds.
No, we won't.
Okay.
Do you want to go to counting birds right now?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
7, 6, 3, 8, 9. That would have made a great counting birds. This is for Anishinaabe, or Native American Chippewa poet I like a lot, Gerald Bisner. Counting birds. As a child, fresh out of the hospital with tape covering the left side of my face, I begin to count birds. At age 50, the sum total is precise and astonishing, my only secret. Some men count women or the cars they've owned, their shirts, long sleeve and short sleeve, their shoes. But I have my birds, excluding, of course, those extraordinary days, the 21,000 snow geese and sandhill cranes at Bosque del Apache, the sky blinded by great frigate birds in the Pacific off Anconcito, Ecuador, the 21,000 pink flamingos at Ngorongoro Crater in Tanzania, the vast flocks of seabirds on the Seri coast of the Sea of Cortez down in Sonora that left at nightfall, then reappeared, resuming their exact positions at dawn, the 1,000 cliff swallows nesting in the sand cliffs of Pyramid Point, their small round burrows like eyes, really the souls of the Anasazi who flew here 1,000 years ago to await the coming of the Manitou. And then there were the usual almost deadly birds of the soul. So the crow was so harnessed I rode one night as if she were a black-feathered angel. The birds I became to escape unfortunate circumstances. How the skin ached as the feathers shot out toward light. The 1,000 birds the dog helped me shoot to become a bird. Grouse, woodcock, duck, dove, snipe, pheasant, prairie chicken. On my deathbed, I'll write the secret number on a slip and pass it to my wife and 2 daughters. It will be a hot evening in late June, and they might be glancing out the window as the thunderstorms approach from the west. Looking past their eyes and a dead fly on the window screen, I'll wonder if there's a bird waiting for me in the sun-rushing clouds. Oh, birds, I'll sing to myself, you've carried me along on this bloody voyage. Carry me now into that cloud, into the marvel of this final night.
I just love that man's voice. I love when he's reading poems. And Marissa, if we could put everyone on screen now, that would be fantastic. We only have about 90 seconds left for the event. And I just wanted to offer the floor to anyone if they had any final comments or wanted to respond. Todd, I know that you were a while ago and you've probably been monitoring the chat. And is there, if you'd like to say something or respond in any way?
Well, I'll tell you, Joseph, I was just absolutely thrilled to hear Jim reading those poems, particularly Counting Birds. And it was so nice to hear the warmth and joy in his voice, and to hear you and Jim laughing together in the studio. That was magnificent. And I just want to say that, I was dazzled by Rebecca's talk. Thank you so much. And Jamie, your reading was incredibly moving. And I'll just say again, I'm so honored to be here with you all tonight. Thank you for including me, Joseph.
Right on. Anyone else have any final words they would like to share?
Just say the same. And it was great to hear his voice before he was ill. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Right on.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Todd.
And Rebecca, you're on mute if you're.
How did that happen? Oh,
there you go.
I wanted to say, hang out with almost 500 people who are wild enthusiasts about poetry and set aside their Thursday evening for it is one of the things that makes me feel good about our species. And so thank you, everybody. It's been a joy and an honor.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And just on that note, I would like to say our species, tonight we made over $20,000 toward the production of the book. So thank you very much for helping us meet our goal. I really appreciate your presence here this evening. I encourage you all to become part of the Heart's work, support Jim's poetry through our Legacy Project. You can find all sorts of information on our website. There's a broadside of an excerpt from Cabin Poem as part of the donor perks. And I really, really appreciate your presence here. Please go forth. Thank you all. Read some poems, especially that emergency wallet poem. See ya.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.